Something that began quietly beneath your awareness after the August 12th solar eclipse may reach a point tonight where pretending not to notice it becomes harder than facing it. You may have felt the pressure building without having a clear explanation for it. Perhaps one particular thought keeps returning during the same part of your day, even after you deliberately push it away. Perhaps there is a conversation you have replayed privately several times this week, imagining different versions of what you might say, only to stop when you reach the sentence you know would change everything. Maybe there is also a situation you have continued calling acceptable, manageable, or fine, even though some quieter part of you knows that the word fine stopped being accurate a while ago. If you recognize yourself in any of these experiences, tonight may help explain why those feelings have remained so close to your awareness recently. Today is August 19th, 2026, and the moon reaches its first quarter phase in Scorpio. This is not simply a loose description of an emotional atmosphere surrounding the week. It is a specific lunar event connected to a specific date, with an exact phase occurring tonight. By the end of this discussion, the focus will be on the 5 zodiac signs most likely to experience a genuine breakthrough through this lunar moment, along with the particular form that breakthrough may take. Because a breakthrough is rarely as dramatic or obvious as people imagine before it arrives. Sometimes it does not look like a sudden victory. Sometimes it looks like finally admitting what you already knew. Sometimes it is a decision. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is the moment when confusion becomes impossible to maintain because the truth has become more uncomfortable to avoid than it is to accept. That is the kind of turning point this lunar phase asks you to recognize. To understand why tonight matters, begin with the meaning of a first quarter moon. Within astrology, this phase represents a point of decision inside the lunar cycle. Something that was introduced at the new moon can no longer remain only an intention, possibility, or private idea. It begins asking for movement. The lunar cycle lasts roughly 29½ days from beginning to completion. It starts with the new moon, when something is planted, sometimes deliberately and sometimes without you fully realizing what you have initiated. Then, roughly 1 week later, the first quarter phase arrives and brings that original intention into contact with its first meaningful test. This is why astrologers have traditionally associated the first quarter moon with the idea of crisis, although that word is better understood in its older sense as a decisive turning point rather than automatic disaster. It describes the point where continued hesitation becomes difficult because circumstances begin requiring a direction. The situation cannot remain indefinitely suspended between possibilities. Something eventually has to move toward one side or the other. Tonight, that decision-making quality is connected directly to the events surrounding August 12th, when the total solar eclipse occurred only 1 week ago. That eclipse established the larger emotional and psychological background for what is unfolding now. Whatever began changing around you or within you at that time may have been subtle. You may not have been able to explain it. You may not even have consciously noticed the beginning. Yet something could have shifted in your perception, your emotional response, your priorities, or your awareness of a situation. During the days that followed, that change has had space to develop quietly. Tonight represents a point where that quiet development may begin asking for recognition. Current astrological commentary specifically presents August 19th as a time for confronting hidden matters and taking decisive steps. That is a strong description, but it fits the nature of this particular combination because the first quarter moon already introduces a demand for choice, while Scorpio brings attention toward everything that exists beneath the obvious surface. Think about the physical appearance of a first quarter moon. Part of the lunar surface is illuminated, while another part remains in darkness. Both portions exist at the same time. The light does not erase the shadow, and the shadow does not mean that the unseen portion is unreal. It simply means that you are not seeing the whole picture yet. This becomes a powerful reflection of what can happen internally during this phase. You may understand one side of a situation clearly, while another side remains hidden behind fear, uncertainty, incomplete information, emotional resistance, or simple unwillingness to look directly at it. The first quarter phase asks you to engage with both sides instead of allowing the unseen portion to remain conveniently ignored. Scorpio makes that process more intense because Scorpio is naturally associated with what exists underneath appearances. It draws attention toward hidden information, unspoken meaning, emotional realities that have not been acknowledged openly, and the difference between what someone presents outwardly and what they actually experience internally. Scorpio also deals with power and boundaries, including the question of who has influence within a relationship or situation and whether that influence is being shared fairly. It connects with intimacy and trust, with shared finances and shared resources, and with the deeper processes of endings and regeneration. This is important because Scorpio is often misunderstood through an unnecessarily frightening lens. The presence of Scorpio does not automatically mean something negative is coming. Its deeper function is exposure. It brings concealed material closer to consciousness so that you can understand what has actually been operating beneath the surface. That can feel uncomfortable precisely because awareness removes the protection that uncertainty once provided. When you do not fully know what is happening, you can continue postponing a decision. You can tell yourself that perhaps the situation will change on its own. You can reinterpret the same behavior repeatedly because the truth has not yet become clear enough to demand a response. But when hidden information becomes visible, that flexibility can disappear. This is where the psychological weight of tonight may become personal for you. You may discover that the most difficult part was never making the decision itself. The difficult part was allowing yourself to acknowledge that you had already reached the point where a decision was necessary. There is a difference between not knowing what you want and knowing what you want, but being afraid of what admitting it will require. There is also a difference between lacking evidence and refusing to trust what repeated evidence has already shown you. Scorpio energy can bring that distinction into sharper focus. It can make you aware of the emotional cost of continuing to maintain an arrangement, simply because changing it would require courage. The first quarter moon then adds pressure for movement, creating a moment where the hidden and visible portions of your experience can no longer remain comfortably separated. You may notice this through recurring thought, a conversation that keeps returning to your mind, a feeling you cannot dismiss, or an internal recognition that becomes stronger each time you try to silence it. None of this means that a particular outcome is guaranteed. Astrology is an interpretive framework, not a prophecy, and this lunar event should be approached as a lens through which you can examine your experience rather than as a fixed verdict about what must happen. You remain the person making the choices. The value of the moment comes from what you become willing to see. Before moving further, notice what is already present within you without immediately trying to explain or solve it. You do not have to force an answer simply because the question has appeared. You can begin by acknowledging that something is there. That small act of recognition can matter because awareness often arrives before language. You may sense that something is changing long before you know exactly what the change means. Tonight carries that same quality. The moon itself is approaching its exact first quarter phase within only a few hours, creating a natural image of something reaching a point of definition. You may be in a similar position emotionally. Something has been developing. Something has remained partially visible. Something has existed between certainty and uncertainty, and now you are being asked to look more honestly at the whole picture. The deeper lesson is not that you must react immediately to every feeling. It is that you should become conscious of what your feelings are revealing. Scorpio does not ask for superficial acknowledgement. It asks for honesty about the emotional truth beneath the explanation you have been giving yourself. If you have repeatedly told yourself that everything is fine, tonight may make you question what fine actually means. If you have convinced yourself that a difficult conversation can wait indefinitely, you may begin recognizing why you keep rehearsing it. If you have sensed an imbalance of power or trust, but avoided naming it, the hidden part of that dynamic may become harder to overlook. This is not necessarily about forcing an ending. Scorpio also represents regeneration, which means that recognizing what is no longer sustainable can become the beginning of something more honest. The significance lies in confronting what has been concealed so that your next choice is based on reality rather than avoidance. The first quarter moon gives the moment its decision point, while Scorpio gives that decision its depth. Together, they create a lunar atmosphere in which the part of your life that has remained beneath the surface may begin demanding a more conscious response. And that is where tonight becomes especially important, because once you understand what this moon is asking you to confront, the next question is which zodiac signs are most likely to feel that pressure as a genuine breakthrough, and what that breakthrough may actually look like when it begins to unfold. What Scorpio brings into focus tonight is not a brand new truth appearing out of nowhere. The truth was already present, but something may have been standing between you and your ability to recognize it clearly. Scorpio works more like a curtain being pulled aside than a message being delivered from somewhere outside of you. What was hidden was already part of the situation, and what changes now is your relationship with what you can finally see. That distinction becomes especially important when we talk about the word breakthrough, because breakthrough is often imagined as one enormous moment when everything suddenly makes perfect sense and life immediately changes direction. Real breakthroughs are usually much less theatrical. They can be almost ordinary, while still changing the way you understand your own life. Tonight, a breakthrough could mean discovering what you genuinely want, after months of being unable to separate your real desire from fear, habit, pressure, or confusion. It could mean finally entering a difficult conversation that you have repeatedly postponed because you already know that certain words cannot be taken back once they are spoken. It could mean recognizing another person's intentions with a level of clarity that simply was not available to you yesterday. For someone else, the breakthrough could involve money-shared financial responsibilities, a decision that has been waiting for an answer, the ending of a pattern that has repeated so many times that repetition itself has become exhausting, or a career move that you have delayed while telling yourself that you were merely waiting for the right moment. The important thing is not to create an expectation that breakthrough must arrive in a dramatic form, because expectations can become a filter that prevents you from recognizing the real event when it appears. You may be waiting for certainty to feel powerful, emotional, undeniable, and overwhelming, while the actual moment may be almost strangely quiet. It could be one sentence that suddenly organizes months of confusion inside your mind. It could be the first moment you notice that a burden you have been carrying feels lighter, even though nothing external has changed yet. It could be a small realization that seems almost too simple to explain why you have struggled with the issue for so long. That is one of the reasons Scorpio can be so psychologically revealing. Its influence does not necessarily need to make a dramatic entrance. It can simply bring something into awareness that you can no longer unknow. Think about how often the most important realizations in your life have actually arrived. They may not have come with a grand announcement. They may have appeared while you were driving, sitting alone, preparing for bed, replaying a conversation, or doing something completely ordinary. Then, hours or even days later, you realized that one quiet thought had changed the way you understood everything around it. That is the kind of breakthrough worth watching for tonight. Scorpio does not need to shout, because revelation can be powerful precisely because it feels internally undeniable. So, as we move into the 5 zodiac signs most directly connected with this lunar moment, hold one question in your awareness. What if the truth you have been trying not to face is not actually coming to punish you, but is finally giving you the freedom to stop living around it? The first sign we need to examine is Scorpio itself, because the moon is moving through Scorpio tonight, placing you closest to the central theme of this lunar phase. If this energy is asking the collective to examine what has been hidden, you may experience that process with unusual immediacy. Your breakthrough is strongly connected with identity, emotional power, and personal boundaries. Something you have tolerated for longer than you genuinely wanted to may suddenly become much harder to excuse. It could be a recurring dynamic, a remark that has seemed small but has gradually weakened your sense of self, or a subtle crossing of a boundary that you repeatedly convinced yourself was not important enough to address. The change may not come because the external situation suddenly becomes worse. It may happen because your internal tolerance changes. There is a moment when the same behavior that you previously explained away suddenly feels different because you have finally understood what it represents. For some Scorpios, this could involve recognizing a passion of manipulation or control that you had sensed for some time without fully identifying it. You may look back at several interactions and realize that the discomfort you felt was not random. There was information inside that discomfort, and tonight may make that information easier to understand. You could also find yourself reaching a point where you no longer want to translate your real feelings into a softer version, simply because the softened version is easier for someone else to receive. Imagine someone who has spent months waiting for certainty about a relationship, a professional situation, or a decision that seemed impossible to move toward in either direction. They've told themselves that they are being patient. They've gathered more information. They've waited for another sign. They've believed that eventually something outside of themselves would provide the final answer. Then tonight, the realization arrives in a surprisingly simple form. Nothing new has necessarily been revealed. Instead, they suddenly understand that waiting longer was never the missing piece. The answer had been present for some time, but acknowledging it required more honesty than they were ready to give it. Scorpio, that is the question I want you to carry with you tonight. What are you finally prepared to stop negotiating with? If something becomes exceptionally clear, do not assume that clarity requires immediate action within the same hour. Your emotional intensity can be completely genuine while your timing still needs space. A realization can be correct without requiring an instant reaction. Write down what you understood. Let yourself sleep before communicating something important, if circumstances allow it. The truth itself may look exactly the same in the morning, but your ability to express that truth without allowing tonight's emotional intensity to control the delivery can be very different. Your next step may become stronger because you allowed the realization to settle. Now we move across the zodiac to Taurus, because Taurus stands directly opposite Scorpio and therefore experiences this lunar energy through the other side of the same axis. For you, the emphasis moves toward relationships, stability, commitment, and shared resources. Something concerning another person may become more difficult to keep in the category of things you are only half acknowledging. A relationship truth could become clearer. A question involving money, jointly managed resources, or something that both people have a stake in could demand more direct attention. You may begin asking yourself a question that is uncomfortable precisely because the answer matters. Is this actually sustainable, or have I continued maintaining it because changing it feels more frightening than remaining inside something familiar? Taurus often values stability because stability creates a sense of safety. But there is a difference between genuine security and simply staying with what you know because uncertainty feels threatening. Tonight may help you recognize that distinction. The breakthrough for you does not necessarily require confrontation. It may involve understanding that peace has a value of its own. You may have been mentally trying to win an argument for a long time, perhaps with another person, perhaps only inside your own thoughts, and suddenly realize that proving your position is not as important as creating emotional steadiness. The Taurus-Scorpio axis carries a fundamental tension between control and security, closeness and independence, holding on and releasing what can no longer be held in the same way. Tonight asks you to look honestly at where you stand within that tension, not where you wish you stood, and not where you have told yourself you stand, but where your actual behavior and emotional reality place you. There is also a quieter kind of breakthrough available to Taurus that may be easy to underestimate. You may simply reach a calm internal conclusion that you already know what needs to happen. No dramatic revelation, no emotional explosion, no sudden external event, just a settled awareness that feels almost ordinary. Do not dismiss that because it lacks intensity. Your relationship with truth can be steady rather than explosive. If your inner response is a quiet sense that you already understand what you need to do, that clarity deserves just as much respect as a more dramatic realization. In fact, for you, calm certainty may be the more authentic expression of the breakthrough. And from there, the energy moves into a very different area for Leo, because your story tonight is less about relationship stability and more about how honestly you are allowing yourself to be seen. The August 12th solar eclipse occurred in Leo, placing your sign at the center of the larger astrological story that has been developing throughout this period. Tonight's Scorpio Moon is not simply repeating what that eclipse initiated. Instead, it is asking you to look beneath the identity question created by that eclipse and examine what remains true when performance is removed. Your breakthrough theme centers on confidence, visibility, and creative direction, but Scorpio changes the way those themes are expressed. The question is no longer only whether you can be seen, it is whether what people see actually reflects who you are. You may suddenly become much clearer about what deserves your attention and what has merely been consuming your attention because of habit, obligation, expectation, or the role you have become accustomed to playing. This can create a powerful internal distinction. Something may be demanding your energy without genuinely deserving it. Something else may be quieter but much more connected to what you actually care about. Some Leos may experience this through career or creative ambitions that have remained undecided or suspended for some time. Tonight could make the direction feel more obvious because the internal performance around the decision begins to fall away. You may stop asking what would look impressive and start asking what actually feels true. For others, the breakthrough may be more personal. You may recognize that you have been presenting a carefully managed version of yourself because that version is familiar, accepted, or easier to control. Yet the person underneath that presentation may no longer fit the role you have been maintaining. Allowing yourself to be visible as you genuinely are can feel vulnerable because once you stop curating the image, you also lose some of the protection that image provided. But that vulnerability can become part of the awakening. The deeper question for Leo tonight is not simply whether you are confident enough to step forward. It is whether you are willing to let your outer life become more honest about what has already changed inside you. And that deeper question is exactly where the next layer of this lunar story begins to open. Leo represents the part of your identity that other people can recognize immediately, the way you enter a room, the image you project, the role you naturally occupy, and the version of yourself you allow the outside world to experience. Scorpio works from a completely different layer. It concerns what exists underneath the image, the feelings you may not reveal, the desires you may not explain, and the private truth that can remain hidden even while everything on the outside appears perfectly composed. Tonight, the moon creates a direct connection between those two layers for Leo, and that can make one question much harder to avoid. Has the person you show the world gradually become different from the person you actually are inside? Your breakthrough may not require greater attention, greater recognition, or a more impressive public moment. It may instead come from becoming radically more honest about what you actually want others to recognize when they see you. This distinction matters because the August 12th eclipse asked you to begin something new. And for Leo, that beginning may naturally have carried a visible quality. It could have involved a new direction, a new role, a public decision, or some other development that was easier to see from the outside. But tonight, the Scorpio Moon asks you to step behind the visible part of that beginning and examine what motivated it in the first place. Was it something you genuinely wanted, or was part of the motivation connected to how meaningful, successful, impressive, or acceptable it might appear to other people? Those questions do not mean the eclipse beginning was wrong. Tonight is not necessarily asking you to abandon it. Instead, think of this as checking the foundation before continuing to build upward. A structure can look beautiful while still needing its foundation examined. In the same way, a decision can look completely right from the outside, while your private emotional response is quietly telling you that something needs to be reconsidered. Tonight gives you space to make that private examination. You may discover that what you truly want is different from what you originally thought you wanted. You may also discover that your original direction is completely authentic, but that you have been carrying unnecessary pressure around how you believe it should look to everyone else. Either realization can become a breakthrough because both move you closer to alignment between your inner reality and your outer identity. Aquarius experiences this lunar moment from the opposite side of Leo, creating another strong connection to the same axis of identity and authenticity. For you, however, the focus moves into community, relationships, future plans, and personal freedom. One of the strongest possibilities tonight is that you begin recognizing that a social role you have carried for a long time no longer represents who you are. You may have become accustomed to being the person who behaves a certain way within a particular group. Perhaps you are the reliable one, the agreeable one, the independent one, the person who keeps things calm, the person who understands everyone else, or simply the version of yourself that causes the fewest disruptions. Over time, familiarity can make a role feel like identity. Tonight may challenge that assumption. You may begin seeing which relationships genuinely belong in the future you are creating, and which connections you have continued carrying primarily because of history, loyalty, memory, or an old version of yourself that no longer exists in quite the same way. This does not mean every Aquarius needs to walk away from people. The deeper issue is whether the relationships you maintain still give you room to remain yourself. Some Aquarians may receive information tonight either directly through a conversation or indirectly through something they observe that causes a long-term plan to shift. Something you previously considered settled may no longer feel completely settled once new information enters the picture. That can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating because a plan that changes in response to greater truth may be more authentic than a plan preserved simply because you once committed to it. For many Aquarians, the deeper breakthrough is likely to involve choosing authenticity over approval. That can be especially difficult when the people whose approval matters are people you genuinely care about. There is a unique kind of emotional conflict in realizing that honesty may disappoint people you love. You may know that you need to express what you actually believe, yet you may also feel the instinct to soften your position until everyone around you remains comfortable. Tonight asks whether maintaining peace has required you to repeatedly edit yourself. You do not have to abandon community to become authentic. The question is whether the particular form of belonging you have accepted still leaves enough space for the person you're becoming. A healthy community does not require you to erase yourself in order to remain included. If you have been making yourself smaller, quieter, less opinionated, or less honest simply to preserve belonging, tonight may help you recognize that pattern. That recognition itself can be the beginning of change. Before moving to Cancer, it is important to widen the meaning of this Scorpio moon beyond the 5 signs that may experience it most strongly. A breakthrough does not have to become visible to anyone else to be real. You might make a private decision that no one hears about. You might establish a financial boundary without announcing it. You might finally have one honest conversation and then return to your ordinary life. You might recognize that something you have been pursuing is unlikely to arrive in the form you imagined, and instead of continuing to chase it, you quietly decide to stop. From the outside, nothing may appear to have happened. Internally, everything may have changed. This is one of the most important things to remember about Scorpio energy. Transformation can begin before there is evidence that anything has transformed. The external world may remain almost identical while your relationship with that world becomes completely different. So, if tonight feels quiet for you, do not assume that means the lunar phase has missed you. Sometimes the most consequential decision is the one you make privately before you're ready to explain it to anyone else. Cancer enters this picture through another water sign connection, which gives your experience of Scorpio a particularly intuitive quality. Your breakthrough theme centers around emotional security, family, home, and inner healing. These are not abstract subjects for Cancer. They touch the places where you seek belonging, comfort, protection, and a sense that you can finally exhale. Tonight may bring you toward an honest admission about what you actually need. You may have become very skilled at adapting to what is available, making compromises, waiting for circumstances to improve, or telling yourself that you can manage without something important. But there comes a point when making do stops being resilience and starts becoming self-neglect. Tonight may help you recognize the difference. Some Cancers may reach a long overdue boundary with family. You may realize that keeping a familiar family pattern intact has required you to repeatedly ignore your own emotional limits. The boundary does not necessarily have to be dramatic. It may simply involve deciding what you will and will not continue accepting. Other Cancers may feel an unexpected desire to change something within their home environment. Your surroundings can carry emotional history, and sometimes a space continues reflecting a previous version of you long after you have changed internally. Tonight may make you more aware of whether your home still supports the person you are becoming, or whether it keeps pulling you psychologically toward an older chapter. There is also a deeper possibility here. An emotional pattern that once protected you may no longer be protecting you in the same way. Something you learned years ago may have helped you survive uncertainty, conflict, rejection, or emotional discomfort. But a coping pattern can remain long after the original danger has disappeared. What once felt like safety can gradually become confinement. That is why the central question for Cancer tonight is whether you are choosing what is genuinely emotionally safe or merely choosing what feels familiar because you already know how to navigate it. Familiarity and safety can feel identical for a long time, but they are not always the same thing. The timing also deserves attention. Around 10:46 p.m. Eastern, the emotional effect of this transit may not necessarily reveal itself through an obvious event during the evening. For many Cancers, the stronger expression may become noticeable afterward, particularly through sleep and dreams. Water signs, and Cancer in particular, can process Scorpio Moon symbolism through the dream state in ways that are not always accessible during waking consciousness. You may wake tomorrow carrying an emotion, image, or unusually clear impression that remains with you longer than an ordinary dream usually would. That does not mean every dream should be treated as a literal message. It means that if something from your sleep leaves an unusually strong emotional imprint, it may be worth paying attention to what your own inner response is communicating. Scorpio does not require conscious awareness in order to bring hidden material closer to the surface. The deeper work can continue while you are resting. And if you are not Scorpio, Taurus, Leo, Aquarius, or Cancer, tonight is not irrelevant to you. The intensity may simply operate more quietly in the background. Aries may notice a financial or emotional issue that has been approached indirectly, finally requiring direct attention. Gemini may find that a conversation they have repeatedly practiced mentally becomes difficult to postpone any longer. Virgo may experience an emotional realization first, followed quickly by the practical decision that needs to follow it. Libra may become more aware of boundaries and fairness within a particular relationship, and recognize that balance requires more honesty than politeness alone can provide. Sagittarius may find that an emotion they have kept buried rises with greater strength than expected, making avoidance more difficult. Capricorn may be confronted with questions surrounding shared resources and trust, requiring genuine honesty rather than the carefully diplomatic response that keeps everyone comfortable. Pisces may experience a noticeable strengthening of intuition, with feelings arriving more quickly or more intensely than usual, although even a powerful intuitive impression still needs to be considered alongside facts. For these 7 signs, the Scorpio Moon may not arrive as a dramatic event that immediately changes the visible direction of life. Instead, it may feel like pressure beneath the surface, a restless mood, an unexplained sense that something deserves attention, a recurring thought, or an awareness that refuses to disappear completely. Do not mistake that quieter expression for a weaker one. Background pressure can be the earliest stage of a breakthrough because it tells you that something inside your awareness is preparing to become more clearly understood. And once you recognize that, the real question is not whether tonight creates a dramatic turning point for everyone, but what you do when that subtle internal pressure finally reveals exactly what it has been trying to show you. What you are experiencing tonight does not have to arrive through a direct connection to your sign or through an opposition in order to matter. Sometimes an astrological influence moves through a more indirect aspect, creating a quieter current that is harder to identify immediately, but still capable of affecting your emotional awareness, your thoughts, and the choices you begin considering. That is why the broader themes surrounding tonight matter for everyone, not only the signs that have the strongest direct connection to the Scorpio Moon. Much of the astrological discussion surrounding this week has continued to emphasize emotional processing, honest communication, greater clarity within relationships, and practical decisions as the underlying subjects moving through this lunar period. The expression may differ from person to person, but the deeper invitation remains similar. Something may need to be understood more honestly before it can be handled more effectively. And that brings us to the part of this entire discussion that may be more valuable than simply knowing whether your zodiac sign appears on a particular list. The real skill is learning how to recognize a breakthrough while it is actually happening. Horoscopes often make breakthroughs sound obvious, as though the universe is supposed to place a giant sign directly in front of you and announce that your life has just changed. Real breakthroughs are usually much quieter. They can happen inside an ordinary moment when nothing around you looks dramatically different. You may still be sitting in the same room, dealing with the same person, looking at the same situation, yet something inside your understanding has shifted enough that you can no longer see the circumstances in exactly the same way. One of the first signs to watch for tonight is a sudden simplification of something that has been confusing you. You may have spent weeks or even months analyzing a situation, examining every possibility, questioning your instincts, replaying conversations, imagining different outcomes, and wondering whether you were missing some crucial piece of information. Then, without necessarily receiving anything new from the outside world, the entire situation may suddenly become easier to understand. It can almost feel disappointing in its simplicity. You may think, after all that mental effort, was the answer really this straightforward? That reaction is completely understandable. Anxiety often creates complexity because the mind keeps searching for possibilities when it does not feel safe enough to trust what is already visible. Once the emotional noise becomes quieter, the underlying truth can look remarkably simple. The simplicity does not make the realization less important. In many cases, it is precisely what makes it meaningful. You are not necessarily learning something new. You are finally seeing something you were already capable of seeing. The second signal is more subtle. You may simply stop chasing an answer. There is an exhausting form of uncertainty that can become almost addictive. You keep returning to the same question, checking the same details, reviewing the same conversation, trying to predict what another person would do, or attempting to force certainty from circumstances that are not ready to provide it. Over time, the search itself becomes part of the emotional pattern. You are no longer only looking for an answer. You are trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing. Tonight may loosen that attachment. You may suddenly notice that the question is still technically unanswered, yet you no longer feel compelled to chase it every few minutes inside your own mind. That is a meaningful distinction. Resolution and release are not always the same thing. Sometimes you do not receive the answer you wanted. You simply become less controlled by the need to receive it immediately. The mental loop becomes quieter. You realize that you can continue living without solving everything tonight. There can be enormous freedom in that moment because your attention becomes available for something other than repeatedly trying to control an uncertain outcome. A third signal may appear through communication. A conversation that previously felt almost impossible can become unexpectedly manageable. This does not mean the conversation will necessarily be comfortable. It means your relationship with the discomfort may change. Yesterday, you may have been more concerned with how the other person would react, whether they would misunderstand you, whether they would become upset, or whether speaking honestly might alter the relationship. Tonight, you may become more concerned with whether the truth is actually being communicated. That internal shift can change everything. Words that seemed impossible to form may suddenly become available. You may discover that you do not need a perfect speech. You do not need to explain every detail. You may simply need one honest sentence. Sometimes courage is not the feeling that arrives before you speak. Sometimes courage is what becomes possible after you stop trying to make the conversation completely safe before beginning it. A difficult truth may have been sitting inside you for days or weeks, waiting less for bravery than for permission. Once you stop negotiating with yourself about whether you are allowed to say it, the words may come more naturally than expected. The fourth signal is a movement away from decision paralysis and toward one clear next action. You may have been staring at multiple possibilities for so long that every choice began to feel equally complicated. This can create decision fatigue, where even small choices become emotionally draining because your mind has been carrying too many unresolved possibilities at once. Then something changes. You may not suddenly know exactly how everything will end, but you become clear about what needs to happen next. That distinction is extremely important. A breakthrough does not require you to possess the entire plan. You may only need to recognize the next honest movement. This is also different from impulsiveness. Impulsiveness says, I suddenly feel like doing something dramatic, so I need to do it immediately. Genuine clarity is quieter. It says, I may not know everything that comes after this, but I can finally see the next step that makes sense. That kind of direction can still require courage. Knowing what to do does not automatically make doing it easy. It simply removes the unnecessary confusion surrounding the decision. A fifth signal may be the one people misunderstand most easily, because it involves an ending that does not necessarily feel like defeat. Something may conclude tonight, emotionally, relationally, financially, or simply within your own internal experience, and the conclusion may initially feel strange because part of you expected an ending to mean that you had failed. Scorpio offers another interpretation. An ending can also represent movement. Something can finish because it has completed its usefulness. A pattern can stop because you have finally recognized that repeating it is no longer helping you. A pursuit can end because you have understood that the outcome you were chasing was not actually aligned with what you need. If something reaches a conclusion tonight, pay attention to the emotional mixture surrounding it. You may feel grief and relief at the same time. You may feel sadness while also recognizing that something inside you is finally breathing more freely. You may even feel unexpectedly peaceful about a decision that would once have terrified you. None of these reactions invalidate the others. Scorpio does not always create clean emotional endings. It can place several truths beside each other and ask you to acknowledge all of them. This is why tonight should be approached with awareness rather than expectation. There are also several things you should consciously avoid doing with this energy, especially if your spiritual practice is important to you and you tend to take intuitive experiences seriously. First, do not confuse heightened perception with paranoia. Scorpio can make subtle details feel more noticeable, but noticing more does not automatically mean interpreting everything correctly. A strong feeling may deserve attention without automatically becoming proof. There is a crucial difference between intuition and suspicion, and tonight that difference deserves careful respect. Second, do not turn every coincidence into an instruction from the universe. A repeated number, an unexpected encounter, a particular phrase, or an unusual coincidence may feel meaningful, but meaning does not automatically equal a command to act. You do not have to turn every symbolic experience into an immediate decision. Third, do not make a major impulsive choice simply because your emotions feel unusually intense. Emotional intensity can tell you that something matters to you. It does not necessarily tell you what the wisest response should be. Those are two different forms of information. A powerful emotion deserves to be acknowledged, but it still benefits from reflection. And perhaps most importantly, do not pressure yourself into producing a breakthrough simply because you were told that tonight is significant. If nothing dramatic happens, that does not mean you missed the energy, failed to connect with it, or did something incorrectly. Sometimes the most appropriate experience of a lunar transit is simply greater awareness. Current astrological commentary repeatedly carries a similar warning for this Scorpio moon, particularly around the danger of jumping to conclusions or reacting too quickly to heightened emotional impressions. That caution is important because the very intensity that makes Scorpio useful for uncovering truth can also make immediate restraint feel frustrating. You may know something tonight and feel an almost physical urge to act on that knowledge immediately. But knowing something and needing to act on it this exact moment are not identical. If the realization is genuine, giving yourself time to process it does not necessarily weaken it. In many cases, it strengthens your ability to communicate and act from it responsibly. Very few truths that become visible tonight will stop being true simply because you wait until tomorrow to decide what to do. So instead of sitting passively and waiting for something dramatic to happen, give yourself a simple way to work with the energy. Observe, name, act. Begin with observation. Notice what continues returning to your awareness tonight. It could be a thought, a feeling, a person, a situation, a decision, or a question that repeatedly comes back even after you attempt to distract yourself. Do not immediately judge it. Do not immediately decide what it means. Just notice the pattern. Then name what you believe is true. You do not need to produce a perfect explanation. You do not need to make it sound wise or spiritual. You can write one plain sentence that says what you honestly recognize at this moment. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the least polished one, because it has not been altered to make anyone else comfortable. Then comes action. But keep the action grounded. You do not need to solve the entire situation tonight. Choose one concrete next movement that genuinely follows from what you have understood. One conversation you need to prepare for. One boundary you need to consider. One practical task that has been postponed. One decision you can clarify, or one pattern you can consciously stop feeding. The point is not to transform your entire life in one night. The point is to move one honest step closer to what you now recognize as true. If you want to make this practice physical rather than keeping everything inside your head, write the 3 stages down on paper. Write what you observed. Write the truth you can currently name. Then write the one grounded action that follows. There is something valuable about placing an internal realization into physical form. Writing can slow the mind enough to separate an authentic insight from a temporary emotional reaction. Keep what you write rather than immediately discarding it. Return to it after a few days, when the intensity surrounding tonight has settled, and read it again with a calmer mind. Ask yourself whether the realization still feels true in ordinary daylight. If it does, you have stronger evidence that tonight revealed something meaningful rather than simply amplifying a passing emotion. That is the deeper lesson of this Scorpio first quarter moon. It is not necessarily about waiting for something spectacular to happen outside of you. The more meaningful event may be the moment you finally recognize what has been happening inside you all along. The breakthrough may be a truth becoming visible, a question losing its power over you, a conversation becoming possible, a direction becoming clearer, or an ending becoming understandable as progress rather than failure. You may not have a dramatic story to tell anyone tomorrow, and that is completely acceptable. Some transformations begin without witnesses. Some decisions are made in silence. Some forms of freedom begin when you simply stop arguing with what you already know. Tonight does not need to prove anything to you. It only needs to give you enough space to notice what has been waiting beneath the surface, understand it without exaggerating it, and decide what one honest step looks like once you are ready to take it. More often, the real significance of a breakthrough is much quieter than people expect. It is the point at which something inside you has become so clear, so persistent, or so emotionally present that continuing to pretend you do not notice it becomes harder than acknowledging it. That is why tonight should not be viewed as an isolated lunar event floating independently from everything else that has happened this month. There is a much larger story unfolding, and tonight represents one meaningful moment within that story. The August 12th solar eclipse opened a new chapter along an entirely new nodal axis, establishing a process that will continue developing across the next 18 months. What began during that eclipse may not have looked dramatic when it first appeared. For some people, it may have been a visible change. For others, it may have been nothing more than an internal reaction, a new feeling, a question that suddenly appeared, or a subtle sense that an old direction no longer felt exactly right. You may not have understood the importance of that moment at the time. That does not mean nothing happened. Some of the most important beginnings are almost invisible when they first take root because you are experiencing the beginning before you have enough distance to understand its meaning. Tonight's first quarter moon belongs to that same unfolding process. It is not disconnected from the August 12th eclipse. Instead, it functions as the first meaningful pressure point where whatever was initiated then begins meeting the reality of choice, action, and emotional recognition. Think of the eclipse as opening a door, and tonight as the moment when you realize you cannot simply stand in the doorway forever. Something that began quietly now asks to become more concrete. You may be noticing circumstances that require a response, emotions that need acknowledgement, or decisions that can no longer remain suspended indefinitely. This does not mean that the entire story must be completed tonight. In fact, expecting complete resolution within a few hours would misunderstand the nature of the larger cycle. Tonight is one stage, not the conclusion. A lunar eclipse arrives on August 28th, continuing this same thread and carrying the process toward another point of revelation. That means tonight sits in an important position between the opening created by the solar eclipse and what the lunar eclipse will eventually bring into greater visibility. It is a hinge within the larger R. The beginning has already happened, but the final meaning has not yet been revealed. This perspective can be deeply reassuring because it removes some of the pressure you may otherwise place on yourself. You do not need to understand everything tonight. You do not need to make every decision tonight. You do not need to transform every area of your life simply because the moon has reached this particular phase. What matters is allowing yourself to recognize what has become clear and giving that recognition enough honesty to continue developing. The process still has weeks ahead of it. What you notice tonight may change shape as new information appears. A feeling may become a decision may become an action may reveal another layer of truth. The important thing is that you remain present enough to recognize the next stage instead of demanding that the entire journey reveal itself immediately. The 5 signs most directly connected with tonight's specific breakthrough pattern are Scorpio, Taurus, Leo, Aquarius, and Cancer. Scorpio experiences the moon directly. Taurus encounters it through opposition. Leo and Aquarius connect through the axis established around identity and visibility, and Cancer shares the water element with Scorpio, creating a particularly intuitive emotional resonance. But if your sign is not one of those 5, do not interpret that as meaning. Tonight has nothing to offer you. The themes remain relevant across the zodiac: honest communication, emotional clarity, and practical decisions that follow genuine emotional realizations can still become important for you. The difference is simply that the pressure may be less concentrated than it is for the 5 signs most directly connected with this lunar position. You may experience it as a quieter awareness rather than a defining emotional moment. Perhaps something has been sitting in the background of your mind, and tonight simply makes you more willing to acknowledge it. Perhaps you notice that your emotional response to a situation has changed. Perhaps a practical decision suddenly becomes easier because you finally understand what you feel. These quieter shifts still belong to the same larger process. If you are watching this and wondering whether you are personally experiencing that shift, take a moment to consider what feels different for you right now. What are you no longer willing to ignore? What are you seeing more clearly? What feels like it is changing, even if you cannot yet explain exactly where it is going? Sharing your zodiac sign and the one thing you feel is genuinely changing for you right now can also help reveal how differently this same lunar moment is expressing itself across the zodiac. Looking a little further ahead, August 22nd brings the sun into Virgo, and that movement changes the atmosphere considerably. The emotional depth and internal excavation associated with tonight's Scorpio moon gradually gives way to a more practical emphasis. Virgo brings attention to old routines, organization, details, structure, and the quiet work required to turn an insight into something useful. This transition is meaningful because there is a natural sequence between the two energies. Scorpio uncovers what has been hidden. Virgo then helps organize what has been uncovered into something that can actually be worked with. You might discover tonight that something is true, but that does not automatically mean you know how to implement that truth in your daily life. You may realize that a relationship needs a boundary without knowing exactly how you will communicate it. You may recognize that a career direction needs to change without yet knowing every practical step required to make the change. You may understand that an emotional pattern is no longer serving you without immediately knowing what a healthier replacement will look like. That is where the timing becomes helpful. If tonight provides clarity but you are not ready to act immediately, there is nothing wrong with allowing the insight to settle. The days ahead offer space for the more practical Virgo energy to help turn what you discovered into organized, workable steps. Tonight is not responsible for completing that entire process. Its role is to make the truth visible enough that something real can eventually be built from it. This is why the distinction between revelation and implementation matters. An insight can arrive quickly. Building a life around that insight takes time. A realization may happen in a single moment, while the practical consequences of that realization unfold across days, weeks, or even longer. So if you walk away from tonight knowing something important but still unsure how to proceed, you are not behind. You are simply standing between awareness and application. The first part has begun. The rest can develop gradually. If you find value in approaching astrology through this kind of structure, where the astronomical and astrological mechanism comes first, and the mystical interpretation follows rather than replacing practical thinking, then staying connected to this kind of discussion can help you understand important lunar moments before they pass rather than trying to reconstruct their meaning afterward. Tonight's exact timing also deserves one final clarification. The first quarter phase occurs close to 11 at night, Eastern, with the exact timing around 10:46 p.m. Eastern. Depending on where you are and when you are watching, you may encounter this discussion before the exact moment or the morning afterward. If you're watching the next morning because you went to sleep before the moon reached its exact first quarter phase, that does not mean the relevance suddenly disappeared. The influence associated with the lunar phase does not behave like a light switch that turns on at one precise minute and then becomes meaningless immediately afterward. The window continues into the following day or two, gradually settling rather than ending abruptly at 10:46 p.m. sharp. If you are receiving this message the morning after, the themes we have discussed still apply. The difference may simply be that you are encountering them after the peak moment has already passed, when the emotional intensity begins to soften enough for you to understand what you experienced with greater perspective. Sometimes that timing is actually useful. A realization that feels overwhelming at night may look much more manageable after sleep. A thought that feels urgent in the moment may become clearer once your nervous system has had time to settle. A decision that felt emotionally charged may reveal its practical shape more easily the following day. That is another reason not to demand immediate action from every insight. Let the information arrive first. Let understanding deepen. Then Decide what deserves movement. If something in this discussion genuinely connected with what you're experiencing, allow yourself to recognize that connection without forcing it into a dramatic story. And if you know someone who has been struggling to face something they already know they need to face, sharing this message may give them permission to stop treating avoidance as a permanent solution. The most important thing to remember is that a breakthrough does not always mean the instant when everything in your life changes. Sometimes it is much simpler and much more personal. It is the moment you finally decide what needs to change next. That decision may be private, it may be gradual, it may take time before anyone else notices its consequences. But internally, it can mark the point where uncertainty stops controlling the entire conversation. Whatever tonight brings into your awareness, allow yourself to meet it without demanding perfection from the moment. You're not required to know the entire path. You only need enough honesty to recognize where you are standing. The August 12th eclipse opened the question. Tonight's first quarter moon asks you to look at your response to that question with greater honesty. The August 28th lunar eclipse will continue the story and reveal more of what this process is becoming. For now, you are standing at the point between those two stages with enough information to recognize that something has begun and enough time ahead to discover what it truly means. You're not arriving too early, and you're not arriving too late. You are simply meeting this moment at the place where the opening created by the eclipse encounters your willingness to look inward and finally acknowledge what has been waiting for an honest answer.